Welcome to the Industry Wants deep dive on greenhouse gas emissions. We're looking at the 2023 scores. I am Karen Diaz, the project manager for the Industry We Want, and here to introduce the initiative and to kick off our session with Michael Sadowski, climate expert and research advisor for the Apparel Impact Institute on this report, and also Joël Mertens, director of HIC product tools at the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, followed by Pauline, Beeck, environmental portfolio lead at the Apparel Impact Institute. Now we have around 60 minutes scheduled for our session. We'll start off with a brief reintroduction to the industry we want and our industry dashboard, and then I'll hand it over to Michael and Joël for a deeper look at the research and the data that sits behind the 2023 score for greenhouse gas emissions, namely their report taking stock of progress against the roadmap to net zero, which was developed by AII and WRI. Now, in collaboration with the industry we want, this data set will be annually updated to unveil where the industry stands, presenting the total estimate emissions for the apparel sector in gigatons until at least 2025. Now, after Michael and Joël's presentation, Pauline will be taking the stage to talk about the Apparel Impact Institute's Climate Solution Portfolio, which is a registry for vetted climate solutions that tackle emissions, and to share more about its two upcoming recent intervention roadmaps. And at the end of this session, Leonie Schmidt, Director of Sustainability Reporting at AII, will join us and will moderate the Q&A and allow all of you to ask the questions to our speakers. So please feel free to use the Q&A function throughout the session, as we will have time for it at the end. Now let's kick off. The industry we want was born of impatience and really frustration with the pace of change, and a belief in the potential to transform the lives of garment workers in a way that has a positive impact on the planet at large. It was initiated by Fair Wear Foundation, the Ethical Trade Initiative, and the Sustainable Apparel Coalition to accelerate progress on social, commercial, and environmental issues. And we have benefited hugely from partnership of many industry experts, our data partners as well that are shown here in the slide, and also widespread industry consultation and input, including from the Apparel Impact Institute, our partner on our environmental impact metric. Now, to remind those of you who have not participated in our activities previously and to familiarize you a bit more with what we do, at the industry we want, we focus on inclusive processes that emphasize the interconnectedness of environmental, social, and commercial practices. We facilitate challenging exchanges in a constructive environment between knowledgeable, but importantly, diverse and creative stakeholders to measure progress, enhance collaboration, drive change, and inform policy where necessary. We also seek to attract, to collect, and connect examples of impactful solutions, such as new ideas, tools, really to amplify their reach and effectiveness so that we can catalyze collective action. And as we are doing with the industry dashboard, we measure the state of affairs of the garment and footwear industry so that we have a shared sense of accountability and transparency on where we're going. Now, as already alluded to, we work across three areas of change: the social, the commercial, and the environmental pillars of change. And within each of these pillars, we've determined key focus areas. And this was done in wide consultation with affected stakeholders and industry experts back in 2021. So for the social pillar, our focus area is wages. For a commercial pillar, our focus area is purchasing practices, and here we work with the Better Buying Partnership Institute. And the environmental pillar, which is the discussion for today, our focus is greenhouse gas emissions. And it is with these focus areas in mind that we launched the first iteration of the industry dashboard back in 22, where we identified wages for the social pillar, purchasing practices, as mentioned, for the commercial pillar, and greenhouse gas emissions for the environmental pillar. And we will continue to reveal this dashboard at the OECD Forum on Due Diligence in the Garment and Footwear sector each year until at least 2025. And here you see the scores for the 2023 industry dashboard. And very briefly, for the wages score, it shows that the average percentage gap between minimum wages and the average living wage estimate in key garment producing countries for 2023 was 48.5%, and that was a 3.5% widening from the previous year. So the gap is increasing. For purchasing practices, and I really recommend you look at the deep dive that we held from May, and you can find it on our website, from a potential range of -100 to +100, the overall score was +40, and that was only 1 point higher than the previous year. And for the emissions metric, it was calculated that the sector is emitting around 0.897 gigatons. So, as mentioned, it's really important for us to use this dashboard and for it to act as an annual traffic light or temperature check for the industry as a whole, to have it as a check-in that will not only help to stimulate progress, but importantly, support alignment, encourage information exchange and collaboration, and where necessary, policy change. But today's session will focus exclusively on greenhouse gas emissions and metric. And I will now hand it over to Michael and Joël to deep dive into these figures. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Karen, and hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. So my name is Michael Sadowski. I was involved with the very first report that World Resources Institute did with the Apparel Impact Institute, and Joël was involved with that as well because the SAC was a key data partner. So we will share an update on that work and talk a bit about our plans to refresh the data in 2024. So next slide, please. So just a little bit of context, and some of you online may know this, but back in 2021, the World Resources Institute worked together with the Apparel Impact Institute to put together the first estimate of greenhouse gas emissions for the apparel sector. We used data from the SAC/HIG, as well as Textile Exchange, to estimate sector emissions for 2019. And then we projected those emissions out to 2030. I'll talk a bit more in a moment about why we used 2019. So this was really the first instance where we used what we think is the best data that we have, which is Textile Exchange and HIG MSI data to calculate the footprint of the sector. And many of you may know that there have been other efforts to calculate the emissions of the sector using different data sources. And we really felt like this was a good chance for us to put together a solid estimate based on widely used data. So we did that in 2021. Last year, AII alone put together a refresh of that data called Taking Stock of Progress Against the Roadmap. This was based on 2021 data, again, using Textile Exchange and HIG MSI data. And so we revised some key assumptions and put out that report in the middle of 2023. With both of these reports, we identified key interventions that the sector should take to bend that emissions curve down out to 2030 and beyond. And I know Pauline will speak to those interventions later, as well as what AII is doing to try to cut emissions across those areas. But the interventions that we identified really, I think, have become the basis for how AII and others are thinking about reducing emissions in the sector. So that's just a bit of history. So first report, 2021, second report, 2023. Next slide, please. And just to give you a little bit of a sense for how we approach this, So we essentially used data from Textile Exchange on the amount of different fibers that are used in the apparel sector. So that really is the basis for the calculation. So that's how much cotton was grown for apparel, how much polyester, in terms of raw materials that were pulled to make polyester. And then we took that information and applied it to Higg MSI data across the value chain. So for example, we used emissions factors for cotton production, turning that cotton into fiber, spinning that fiber into yarn, and then knitting and weaving and dyeing that. So we use Higg MSI data to come up with this number. You may know that the textile exchange information, there's a 1-year lag. And so I'll speak more about this in a moment, but Textile Exchange puts out their report every year, usually in the fall, and it's for a year prior. So we're using data that is 1 year behind, but we think it's the best data that the industry has. And so this graphic that you see just basically shows how we come up with our figure. Textile exchange data, and then basically multiplying that by Higg MSI data points across the 4 tiers in the value chain. Our commitment from the beginning was that over time, we would work to refine the data and improve it. So as we were getting better data through textile exchange, through the MSI, we would actually refine and improve our data over time, which I'll show you more in a moment. So next slide, please. So again, we've written about this in the 2 reports, but we've been pretty transparent from the beginning about key limitations that we have in the data. So you can read how we describe some of the limitations in the Higg MSI data, for example, that some of that data is representative of the industry, but it's not necessarily always specific to every place, for example, where cotton is grown. And so this is a limitation in the data that we have. We know that emissions factors are derived from life cycle impact data sets, and that may come from a material made in a certain place, but we're kind of extrapolating that across a global apparel value chain. And we know that over time, what we really need is primary data, right? So ideally, we would have, for every company that makes apparel, the actual data across their full value chains and not life cycle based data. That's something that we will continue to work towards. And I think as tools like the Higg FEM mature, I think that may be possible in some instances, but we've been pretty clear about those limitations. We also, and in that red box, you can see, we've made some assumptions around the amount of fiber that goes into apparel, and we'll continue to refine that as we have better information over time. So next slide, please. So this was the score for the 2023 report that we put out. And again, there's a time lag. And so for calendar year 2021, so this was textile exchange data for fiber used in apparel in 2021. The total greenhouse gas emissions for the sector was 896 million tons, or 0.897 gigatons, if you prefer that unit of measurement. That number is slightly down from the prior year. Actually, I think it's slightly up from the prior year, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. I think that headline number is important, but what's maybe more important, at least in my view, is the breakdown across the different tiers of the value chain. So on the bottom of this slide, you can see that just over half of sector emissions come in tier 2, material production, which is things like knitting and weaving, dyeing and finishing. About a quarter comes from raw material extraction, so cotton farming, extracting fossil fuels to make polyester and nylon and other synthetics. And so, we have the headline number, and we also know the breakdown of where those emissions are occurring. I think it's also important, and Pauline, you may speak to this later, that we do know also the kind of the energy mix in each of the tiers. So for example, for tier 2, we know that, in apparel, dyeing and finishing and knitting and weaving, a good majority of the energy is coming from thermal energy, right? It's coal boilers to heat water. and to drive other industrial processes. It's not so much electricity, whereas for tier 1 and tier 3, electricity is a bigger driver of emissions. And so that's important to keep in mind as we think about solutions to addressing climate in each of these tiers, right? You can't, for electricity, generally renewable energy is a solution depending on, where you are in the world, where I would say it's more challenging to replace coal boilers in tier 2. So we know the high level number, we know the breakdown. If you can go to the next slide, please. So yeah, so the number was a slight increase from 2019 to 2021. This is driven by a small increase in the fiber amount that we used from 2019 to 2021. There were some changes in the background data, electricity intensity, and again, this is what we set out to do from the beginning, that we would revise the data as we had better information. We also knew that there were some improvements in dyeing and finishing from 2019 to 2021. And so a small increase, obviously, we're trying to drive emissions down, so any increase is not ideal, but I think it's at least good to see that the increase was pretty small in the scheme of things. So that was the change from 2019 to 2021. Next slide, please. And then, as we've mentioned, we are in the process of refreshing the data as the most recent textile exchange report just came out in December of 2023. So that report has fiber volume data for 2022. And so we're going to be taking that information and running the same process that we did last year. So one key input is this new fiber volume data from Textile Exchange. And that image that you see on the left is just a screenshot of one of the graphs from the most recent Textile Exchange report. And I'll let Joël speak at a high level to some of the changes we'll see from the MSI side.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, hi everyone. Happy to be here, and thanks for joining the webinar. Just maybe a little refresher on what the emission factors are that are coming out of the HIG MSI. So the HIG MSI is an LCA-based tool, and really what that means is it's combining data from both primary sources of information where available with secondary sources of information where you don't always have visibility. Because when we're talking of life cycle, really same as scope 3, it's including all of those upstream indicators that you generally won't have information on. And examples of this can include, right, I may be a farmer that is buying fertilizer. Well, I don't know the exact impacts of making that fertilizer, so but I still need to account for that in my scope 3 footprint. Or maybe I'm a dye house that is using different dyeing chemicals. I need to account for that, or even things like the compression and transport of liquefied natural gas and how that makes its way into the market. It's more than just the burning of it. So all of these are factored into the kind of LCA data sets, which also means that there's a lot of things that can be updated with them over time. 4 things I'm going to highlight today that are changing with the 3.7 emission factors, which is what we'll be using for the 2022 data. First and foremost is the update to the IPCC AR6 emission factors. And what that ultimately means is the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, right? They have their kind of base studies on certain emissions. So, if I apply nitrogen fertilizer to the soil, how much actually turns into nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas, or what's the emissions associated with different greenhouse gas refrigerants. All these things are kind of like, there's certain things that the IPCC kind of investigates to say, what is the CO2 equivalent of these different types of emissions. So AR6 is the newest one that was released, I believe it was 2019. And now we've fully implemented that into the HIG MSI. So this will result in some small changes to scores, as basically we're just refining the scientific basis of the CO2 equivalents for an individual process. It's not actually changing the amount of anything, but it's changing what that means in CO2 equivalents. Within the data set, we're using Sphera's life cycle data set. And part of the benefit of that is that as electrical grid changes are happening, they're updating that every year, and that pushes into all the processes that we are then using. So when you think of electricity, of course, that's not only the direct electricity, but electricity that is used in the upstream of every other process. So it really is that cascade effect. So back to like, okay, I'm a dyeing manufacturer. There's the thermal energy that I'm using directly. There's maybe some electrical energy in that process as well. But there's also electrical energy associated with like manufacturing the chemicals that went into that process, or electricity. There's a whole range as we get into the background. So that affects not only the surface data, but also everything into the background of that change. We do have some new primary data that is being reflected into the MSI, and that's primarily, in this case, I'm going to talk about the man-made cellulosic fibers, some updated data on those that just, again, bring it a little bit closer to being representative of what's happening, especially as that industry evolves and changes. And then the last is synthetic fibers. A lot of the impacts are changing there, not due to the changes in the manufacture of the plastic, but actually due to the precursor chemical molecules. So if you think of like, okay, polyester is made of different monomers, those monomers are made of different chemicals. Those chemicals, the way that those are synthesized, there's been some updates to the modeling for those. So that's again coming from our data partner Sphera, and ultimately pushes through to the rest of the MSI data. So between those four things, we do expect that there will be some pretty noticeable changes with the numbers, and it's going to be really fun to speak to that in this next report. Looking forward to it. And I think with that, I'm not going to go into too much more detail here. I'll pass it over to Pauline to talk more about the climate solution portfolios.
Great, thank you. So if we just move to the next slide, for those of you who are perhaps not familiar with the work that AII is doing on the climate solutions portfolio, so this is something that we launched in 2023, and that was a recognition that as a kind of an implementation leader in the sector, being connected to lots of different parts of the ecosystem, we had the opportunity to really kind of supercharge impact and implementation. And as Michael has alluded to, a lot of that implementation work and how we kind of find and vetted solutions is guided by that net zero report and the different levers that have been identified as being the most impactful for decarbonization in the apparel sector. If we go to the next slide, please. So the climate solutions portfolio in large part stems from the Fashion Climate Fund. So we have the ambition to generate a $250 million fund, which has the overall goal of unlocking $2 billion in capital towards reducing emissions by 50% by 2030. So on the one hand, the Fashion Climate Fund can provide grant funding to applications to the climate solutions portfolio. So this is organizations, innovations, projects that need a little bit of a boost so that they can demonstrate their potential for impact and then become kind of a more mature solution, one that can scale. But it's the climate solutions portfolio is not just for grant funded projects. So we are also looking for mature solutions who are already being deployed at scale, but who can further deploy, as we know there's a lot of work to be doing. So that's where the blended capital comes in. So they probably don't need grant funding because they're established organizations, but the facilities who are implementing them might need support in actually kind of getting the funding for the capex needed to do that implementation. So that's where we're connecting with the financial community to kind of help make those big investments. And it's not only connecting the financing, but really connecting the solution providers to facilities by way of AII's programs. We go to the next slide. So really what we're trying to help the sector understand with this climate solutions portfolio is three key kind of questions. So what solutions exist to reduce emissions? Which of those are actually credible and verifiable? So, they have the data to back it up. We know that they work and that data matches the claims that they are making. And of those, because there are many, which do we prioritize? And again, that's where that net zero roadmap comes in and really kind of categorizes the different levers of reduction that we can pursue. And those are then the thematic areas that the Climate Solutions portfolio is focusing on, both from a grant making perspective, but generally speaking, in having those mature solutions as well. So last year was when we kind of first had this, the first time AII was a grant maker, and we learned a lot through that, in particular by reviewing, you know, the great volume of applications that we got and the different areas that they addressed. And one of the key learnings we got from that is that in some cases, the advisory council kind of felt that, well, there isn't really an industry alignment on how to move forward with this topic. So that's where the industry roadmaps come in. If we go to the next slide, there were two topics in particular where we got quite a lot of applications. So energy storage being one, and alternatives to alternative fuel types for thermal energy. And what really came out from those applications is that, well, that many of them were not kind of taking a very context-specific approach. And for both of these decarbonization levers, you do have to take a very site-specific approach even. And the other kind of key learning that came from that is that, well, the industry doesn't really have a vision. It has a goal, of course. We know that moving away from coal, for example, is incredibly important, and there are many targets set according to that, but there's not so much the actual roadmap of how to achieve that. So the intent for the roadmaps, and so there will be one looking at the potential for energy storage and another developing a roadmap for the transition to low carbon thermal energy. The intent is really to develop an industry vision and knowledge base so that we can move forward in those areas. And you know, ultimately, we've designed these so that we, as AII and the Advisory Council for the Climate Solutions portfolio, can then better fund applications that come into these areas. But it's also very much going to be a public document. So brands, facilities, and also the investor community can then use these as resources to impact their decision making, whether you're looking at, you know, your own greenhouse gas emissions targets and how these might play into it. Hopefully the roadmaps will then help you kind of make decisions in those areas. So it's really meant to kind of accelerate action on these topics. If we go to the next slide, there's just a bit of kind of the specific questions that we're trying to answer. So for energy storage, it's something that is very new in the textile and apparel sector. It's being leveraged more in other sectors. So we're really looking to learn in what cases it can help, for example, a stronger business case for solar PV, or where thermal storage might help reduce the kind of energy needed to power a tier 2 plant, for example. And really to kind of take this picture of what potential does this have for driving further emissions reductions in this sector. And then on the low carbon thermal energy side, we are going to do an overview of all of the, you know, the main options that we have on low carbon thermal energy, and really answering the question of in which context do different technologies make the most sense? Because it's not going to be a one size fits all. And it's really important when we are making these really long-term decisions that are also often very expensive, that we're making the right one. And that's really what we're hoping to do there. And then just quickly on the next slide, this was a slightly different approach to selecting grantees. Typically, we have kind of an open call for projects, and that's what we did in the first half of the year. But because we very specifically you know, designed these projects ourselves, we had a bit of a closed call where we invited organizations to just apply for these projects and then reviewed their proposals to delivering them. So we have the Carbon Trust, which has a lot of expertise in the kind of systems level thinking, in particularly around energy storage, that will be delivering that roadmap. And then Global Efficiency Intelligence is going to be delivering the low carbon thermal energy roadmap, because they've done a lot of work in this space as well. So on to the next slide. The methodology we're taking for both roadmaps is quite similar, and the real intent behind this methodology is not only that it's robust and it answers all of the questions we want answering, but really we want this to be a tool for everyone. So it should be data-driven, scientific-driven, but importantly accessible to all audiences. So there will be, a technology evaluation tool table to kind of facilitate decision-making, and that will be applicable kind of across geographies. So we want it on the one hand to be usable by the top, all of the top garment producing countries, but then we will also have region specific insights, so focusing on the highest producing countries as well, again because so much of this is context specific. We would love to do a roadmap for every single country, but yeah, we have limited resources, so we're really kind of in this instance focusing on certain regions, but the kind of generic principles will be applicable across geographies. There will be a technology readiness scale, so to really look at, is this technology suitable for now? Is it maybe something that will be more available later on? Importantly, what is the cost of these different solutions? What is actually the emissions impact? And not just looking, what the opportunities are, but also the barriers. So be those financial, technological, supply chains, so whether or not you can access this equipment, and of course, policy as well. A lot of the applicability of these different alternatives does matter on about the kind of policy framework of a specific country, and we'll be giving advice there as well on how those policies might have to change to make certain technologies become more viable. And again, because it's context specific, it will also be looking at the actual energy supply of a given country, because that will impact the viability of different options. And all of this will then be kind of synthesized into a roadmap to look at, okay, what can we hope to achieve by 2030, 2040, and 2050, and really see, in particular on the low carbon thermal energy side, to what extent can that transition happen across this timeline, and what solution is going to make most sense where. So the next slide just kind of wraps that up a little bit more neatly. There will be 2 work packages. The first being a more kind of generic overview, so looking at the different technologies and their kind of principles for implementation that can be applied across countries. And then the second work package goes into detail, so really looking at those regional focuses, and that will actually be done using facility data. So we want to really kind of model, a typical wet processing facility in China, for example, or in a specific region in China. What can they expect to be the best alternative when they want to make this transition to low carbon thermal energy? So that really makes it more actionable, and of course grounded on real data, and that will ultimately then impact the roadmaps. Work package 3 is not a part of what we're doing, what we've commissioned yet, but that will be the basis of our targeted call for projects in September. So we really want to fund projects in this area, which is projects of implementation, which is why we've commissioned these roadmaps. Roadmaps will then inform the specific implementation projects that we want to commission in September. So that will be an opportunity for solution providers to apply and receive grant funding there. If we go to, I think, what is the final slide of this section. So because it is meant to be for brands, manufacturers, the financial community, we do want the eventual users of these reports to be involved in the creation. So there will be 2 kind of junctures within the project that will have kind of small engagements, small just because we want the discussions to be fruitful. And the idea there is to have a brand session and a manufacturing session, and for the kind of solution providers essentially to present the deliverables, have a bit of a discussion and see if some of the assumptions need to be tweaked, and of course to get everyone's perspective on how this is going to be used, and to make sure that it's useful for the sector. So if you are kind of interested in being involved, please do get in touch, although I will say we want to keep the numbers kind of around the 15 to 20 mark to make sure that we can actually have a fruitful discussion. And these will be published sort of towards July, August, and we're very excited for what they will reveal.
Just to close the Q&A session, I would then like to hand over to Karen to close the webinar and give you a few updates at the end of the webinar.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Michael, Joël, Pauline, and Leonie. And of course, our audience for sharing these questions. It's been a really engaging session, and I'm glad that we were able to do this before the kickoff of the update of the industry dashboard, which will take place on February 20th at the OECD Forum. And before that, we will still have our final deep dive for the 2023 scores on wages, and that's on the 7th of February. I hope that many of you register, and thank you so much for joining us from wherever you are in the world, and hope to see you at our next event.